Hello and welcome to the New Walden Book Club. I'm John Gravino, the author of The Immoral Landscape of the New Atheism. And today we're talking about, in fact, we're continuing our discussion of the new Eric Metaxas book, If You Can Keep It, The Forgotten Promise of American Liberty. Today we're talking about the Golden Triangle of Freedom. It's the title of Chapter 2 of his book, and it's really the main idea of the book. This is my rendition of the Golden Triangle of Freedom. It looks a little bit something like that. And if you're like a lot of people, during this election season, you might have been a little bit worried about the health of our country and our democracy, given all the civil unrest and the violent protests and vandalism and so forth. If you were reading newspapers and magazines and listening to discussions on television, you've heard people talking about are we seeing the beginnings of a civil war? Is our American democracy crumbling? And these are also the worries that Eric Metaxas expresses in his book. And what if it's true? What if we are seeing the unraveling of our democracy? An important question would be, who's to blame? If you take the Golden Triangle seriously, the blame lies with the new atheists. And the reason for that is because, according to the Golden Triangle, the American democracy cannot survive without Christianity. That's a very controversial idea, one which would be rejected by many people today. And so we're going to look at the Golden Triangle and see how it arrived at this very controversial conclusion. So here's the Golden Triangle once again. Eric Metaxas tells us that it's not his original idea, but it comes from a friend of his who wrote a book called A Free People's Suicide. The author is Os Guinness, and he describes the Golden Triangle of Freedom in that book. The Golden Triangle of Freedom summarizes the necessary conditions for our American democracy. Freedom requires virtue, virtue in turn requires faith, and faith requires freedom. So let's try to unpack all of that. We'll start with the right side of the triangle. Freedom requires virtue. By freedom, we're talking about free government, government by the people, for the people, etc. Another word for that is self-government. Well, self-government has more than one meaning. It certainly can mean democracy when applied to politics or government, but the term can also be applied to the individual person. And when it's applied to the individual person, self-government can mean the ability to govern one's passions or one's desires. In this second sense, it's very close to the virtue of self-control, which we have in our bottom right-hand corner. And so we can see that, in fact, self-government and self-control are very closely connected concepts. This makes sense at a common sense level. Think about how our democracy operates. We have elections, there are court cases that are heard and decided, and the simple reality is not everybody can win. Sometimes you're going to lose an election, sometimes you're going to lose the court case. If you don't have self-control, if you can't accept no for an answer, if you can never deny yourself, then how are you going to ever accept an election or a court case that goes against you? You won't be able to. If you have to insist on your having your own way, then anytime democracy works against you, you're just going to rebel. And that really isn't democracy working. That's just anarchy with superficial democracy sprinkled on top like icing or something. The founders understood that for democracy to work, you need citizens who are capable of self-control, who can accept defeat in an election or in a court case. And Metaxas does a great job of quoting the Founding Fathers on this, and I'm sharing with you right now something from John Adams that Metaxas quotes. Let me read this to you. "We have no government armed with power, capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. So clearly we can see here echoes of this golden triangle. Adams is clearly saying that our democracy just cannot work if people cannot control their passions. Let me finish this. I'm in the red part now. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So Adams here is saying that our democracy not only requires a virtuous citizenry, a moral people, but it also requires a religious people. And so that brings us to the base of our triangle. Virtue requires faith. This is easily the most controversial dimension of the Golden Triangle. Many people, I would say, would reject this idea today. Certainly the new atheists would reject it, and I'm sure that most all secular people would reject this idea. In fact, what's very popular today is a very contrary idea, one expressed quite succinctly by Christopher Hitchens. Religion poisons everything. If religion poisons everything, then it's good for nothing. And certainly if you believe that religion is good for nothing, then certainly it can't be essential to our democracy. So this is a very controversial idea, and we're going to spend this discussion trying to understand how the Golden Triangle reaches this controversial conclusion. But before we do that, we have to complete the triangle. Faith requires freedom. We said that the Founding Fathers appreciated Christianity, religion, as a means for cultivating self-control in the citizens. Well, if we attempted to impose that Christianity or that religion on the people by the government, then we would be defeating the goal of cultivating self-control by imposing government control. So the Founding Fathers understood that self-control and government control are at odds with one another. If your goal is to cultivate self-control, then you want to stay as far away from government control as possible. Hence, the inclusion of freedom of religion in the Bill of Rights. But as I said before, our real focus for this discussion is the base of the triangle. Virtue requires faith. And this is what we're going to be looking at in our discussion here. There are different ways that we can translate that. Do we need faith to be virtuous? The atheists ask a very similar question. Do we need God to be good? To specifically apply that to the Golden Triangle, we might ask, do we need Christianity to foster the virtue of self-control, the one virtue essential to self-government? What we're going to do is we're going to look at the evidence and see if there's any evidence to support what the Golden Triangle is trying to teach us. To do that, we're going to have to go a little bit beyond Eric Metaxas' book. There isn't a whole lot of evidence in there. In fact, what I'm going to do is use some of the research that I did for my own book, The Immoral Landscape of the New Atheism. In Chapter 4, I'm asking some of the same questions that Metaxas is dealing with in his book. A lot of the evidence from my book comes from neuroscience, and that's what we're going to be seeing in this presentation. So here's our hypothesis, which we get from the Golden Triangle. The question we're asking is, does the loss of Christianity produce a loss of self-control? And so that's our hypothesis. Where we see a loss of Christianity, we should see a loss of self-control. This turns out to be a very auspicious time for studying that question. According to studies done by the Pew Research Center, we are in the midst of a great period of de-Christianization in our country. over the past 10 years or so, the Pew Research Center has been studying the American religious landscape, and they've found some quite surprising things. This article that appeared in the Pew Research website compared these two religious landscape surveys. The first one took place in 2007, and the second one took place in 2014. Here are the numbers. This column here gives us the numbers for 2007. These numbers are for 2014. The big shocker, and the one that got all the attention from the media, was this number right here. The unaffiliated, that would be those people who claim no religious affiliation. These are people who have no religion. In 2007, they made up 16% of the American population. In 2014, almost 23%. They, in that brief 7-year period, they overtook Catholics and mainline Protestants. They jumped from the fourth largest religious group in the country to the second largest group in the country, just barely missing the first place, just a little bit behind evangelical Protestants. And that has really changed. So our religious landscape has changed dramatically, and you'll see that it's also changed our political landscape, because the Pew Group also studied how this change in the religious landscape was impacting our political parties. And what they found was that it really affected the Democratic Party. So let me get my pen going here. You can see in 2007, here are the same numbers. The bottom row is 2007, top row is 2014, and in the back here we've got the those with no religion. We can see that back in 2007, they made up, those without religion made up 19% of the Democratic Party. 2014, 28%. They became, and so today, those without religion make up the biggest religious group of the Democratic Party. So a huge increase in those without religion in the Democratic Party. The Republican Party was not as dramatically affected by the surge in secularization in society. You can see here that in 2007, boy, this pen thing is frustrating. In 2007, only 10% of Republicans had no religion. That number jumped modestly to 14% in 2014. But actually, the Republican numbers are pretty stable. Catholics dropped a point, not too bad. Mainline Protestants had the biggest drop of 4% in the Republican Party. Evangelical Protestants actually gained a point. So the religious nuns, as they're called, N-O-N-E-S, are not having as much of an impact on the Republican Party as on the Democratic Party. So if you remember the old John Lennon song, Imagine, and he asks us to imagine no religion, we don't have to do that any longer. We're already seeing what the world looks like with religion on the decline, with Christianity disappearing from the landscape. So if our hypothesis is correct, and the loss of Christianity produces a loss of self-control, then because the largest group of the Democratic Party claims no religion, we should be seeing a loss of self-control in the Democratic Party. Well, that's exactly what we saw in this election season. All throughout the primary season, throughout the election season, Democrats fighting with everybody. They couldn't get along with each other. You had your Bernie supporters fighting with your Hillary supporters. Even their Democratic convention was filled with booze and uncivil behavior. But what we saw on display against Republicans was truly deplorable. I'm thinking of San Jose. Trump supporters were leaving their Trump rally and were greeted by angry mobs of liberal Democrats who were throwing punches and throwing eggs and were just terrorizing the Trump supporters. In Chicago, the Trump rally didn't even get off the ground. They had the disruptors, the Trump haters of the Democratic Party had managed to close down roads. There were fights breaking out all over the place, and they had to cancel the rally. Inauguration Day, we saw cars being burned. We saw clashes with police officers. And in the most horrific thing that I saw online, one Democrat actually set a Trump supporter's hair on fire, a young girl. And I don't know. I sure hope that somebody is looking for this criminal, and I hope that. And they caught her face on camera. She should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. There's no. It is shocking. It is shocking what we've seen in this election season. Very, very disturbing indeed. So a big question that should be on people's minds is this: why can't the secular left control itself? Now, we have a hypothesis. The Golden Triangle offers us a hypothesis. The Golden Triangle blames their lack of Christianity. Now, it's going to take a little bit of explanation to make a convincing argument, but let's take a shot at it. Let me just say from the beginning that I am convinced that the Golden Triangle is exactly right. It's basically the same argument that I make in my own book. Eric Metaxas also tells us in his book that he also agrees with the Golden Triangle on this point, that the loss of Christianity is not a good thing for our democracy. And as he points out very well, even the Founding Fathers accepted this idea. So, the question is, how does a loss of Christianity result in a loss of self-control? Well, the key is this. Generally speaking, in fact, this is practically a universal truth. When people reject Christianity, what they're really rejecting is Christian asceticism. They're rejecting the doctrine of the cross. Unless you take up your cross and deny yourself, you cannot be my disciple. This is what people gleefully reject when they reject Christianity. What they love to do when they reject Christianity is to throw off all the restrictions and live a life according to their heart's desire. We see this especially with the most important critics of Christianity in the recent past. Both Nietzsche and Freud, huge and influential critics of Christianity, rejected Christian asceticism in particular. And they claimed that Christian asceticism was actually to be rejected because it was psychologically harmful. Ayn Rand, very influential in the 20th century, especially among Republicans, claimed that Christian asceticism was based on a false theory of human nature that taught that human nature was bad. Ayn Rand said, hogwash, there's nothing wrong with human nature. Human nature is good, and so the desires that come from that human nature are also good, and so should be pursued. We should live by our desires because they're good and they're healthy. Selfishness is a virtue, according to Ayn Rand, and she wrote a book with that title, The Virtue of Selfishness. The New Atheists also critics of Christianity who, no coincidence, reject Christian asceticism. Richard Dawkins, in his book The God Delusion, recommends throwing out the Ten Commandments of the Bible and replacing them with an updated version of the Ten Commandments. And one of his new commandments that he recommends for all of us is that we ought to enjoy our sex lives, as if we're not doing that already. Clearly, there's a single message coming from the critics of Christianity, and that is that we ought to reject Christian asceticism, that we need to enjoy ourselves more, lighten up, enjoy yourselves, enjoy your desires. But, the Bible does more than simply tell us to practice asceticism. It actually gives us a rationale. It explains it. In the first letter of Peter, chapter 2, verse 11, he says, abstain from the passions of the flesh that wage war against your soul. And you can see on the slide here that I put in parentheses mind. The reason why is because when you read what spiritual writers have to say about the soul, and when they describe the soul, it's clear that they're talking about the mind. Alphonsus Liguori writes about the soul, and he mentions three of its characteristics. One is memory, another is intellect, another is will. Clearly, when he talks about the soul, he's referring to the mind. And so St. Peter is telling us in his letter that the passions of the soul wage war against our minds. Galatians chapter 5 tells us that asceticism promotes self-control. Now, Sigmund Freud, this is what Sigmund Freud really took issue with respect to Christian asceticism. He actually rejected this idea of Galatians 5. He actually said the very opposite. He said that Christian asceticism undermined our powers of self-control. So we have two very diametrically opposed theories about self-control. The Bible says that asceticism promotes self-control. Freud said that asceticism undermines self-control. Enter the 21st century, and the advent of neuroscience settles the debate for us. It turns out that the Bible was right and Freud was dead wrong. Asceticism does promote self-control, and a neuroscientist by the name of Dr. Peter Whybrow explains this in his book American Mania, which I have right here. Loved this book. I highly recommend it. Lots of important insights in that book. He writes from a scientific point of view. There is absolutely no religion. There's not a drop of scripture in it anywhere. It's a completely empirical and scientific argument that makes the argument that America has lost self-control because of its culture of consumption and materialism. And he explains it to us by describing to us how the dopamine reward system of the brain works. And I've got a little model of it right here. So the whole, this dopamine model of addiction starts with our consumption. You take a bite of something that's delicious, and this activates the dopamine system in our brains, increasing dopamine, and this increased dopamine increases our desires. Increased desires, as we all know from experience, diminishes our power of self-control, and this leads to more consumption, and the cycle repeats itself with increasing dopamine, increasing desire, and yet more diminished self-control, leading to more consumption. The cycle continues to repeat itself over time until we've lost complete control and we become addicts. And so what we see is loss of what neuroscience has taught us is exactly what the Bible taught us all along, and that is asceticism promotes self-control while indulgence and consumption undermine self-control and leads to addiction. Exactly what the Bible has always taught. This means that a self-indulgent culture exactly what was encouraged by Freud and Nietzsche, by Ayn Rand, and by the New Atheists. This encouragement to indulge in our desires actually leads to addiction. And addiction is a mental illness. There are four major categories of mental illness recognized today. Two of them are substance abuse and ICD, impulse control disorders. Both of these being mental disorders that arise from a loss of self-control. In fact, Dr. Whybrow tells us that the name American Mania is the name that he gives to a mental disorder caused by overindulgence. So how do you like that? He names a mental illness after our own country. Just think about the implications of that for a minute. Ask yourself, what's he saying about our culture? How toxic is our culture according to our overindulgent culture? Another book that supports what Whybrow is talking about here is another one called The High Price of Materialism by Tim Kasser, a psychologist. He finds his conclusions agree with Dr. Whybrow. Overindulgence, values that place a high value on materialism and narcissism and selfishness lead to mental illness. And also, in addition to that, they also lead to antisocial behavior and violence, according to Tim Kasser. And so what we see here is that all the critics of Christianity, Freud, Nietzsche, Ayn Rand, the New Atheists, who encourage us to throw off asceticism and rather to engage in, to indulge our desires. Actually, it turns out that this is a perfect formula for mental illness, a perfect formula for addiction, and a perfect formula for creating antisocial behavior. And so what secularism has brought to us, what de-Christianization has brought to us, with its emphasis on materialism and hedonism and selfishness, is it's brought addiction, mental illness, and violence. And so neuroscience is agreeing with the Bible that when we get rid of asceticism, Christian asceticism, we become addicted to our desires, we become addicted to selfishness, and we become violent. This is a perfect recipe for secularization becomes a perfect recipe for violence, and it also becomes a perfect recipe for making a liberal Hollywood celebrity. Yes, they are secular. Yes, they reject Christianity. Yes, Hollywood celebrities are materialistic and hedonistic and selfish. And yes, we just read any newspaper or magazine. Yes, they have a huge problem with substance abuse and mental illness. And yes, they even have a problem with violence, as we saw in this election season. Madonna, the material girl herself, wants to blow up the White House. Rosie O'Donnell wants to see our Constitution thrown out and martial law. She wants to see a military dictatorship. And Sarah Silverman is advocating for a military coup. And so we see Hollywood is just confirms all of the predictions of the Bible. It confirms all of the predictions made by the Golden Triangle of Freedom and neuroscience. So let's be clear here. The Golden Triangle of Freedom is in perfect agreement with the Bible, which is in perfect agreement with what neuroscience has discovered, which is that the values of Hollywood and the secular left are a perfect recipe for mental illness and for antisocial behavior. And that's exactly what was on display this entire election season. Leftist pagan Hollywood thus gives us a perfect example of how to fail as a democracy. And that perfect recipe is selfishness. If you want democracy to fail, then become a selfish Hollywood celebrity. And this particular election season was very ugly and sad to see, really. But if you would like a lighter take on this whole thing, I recommend taking a look at an old music video by Brad Paisley called Celebrity. It's absolutely hilarious, but it tells the story of what we all know to be true about that narcissistic, self-indulgent industry. The conclusion that Dr. Whybrow draws at the end of his book, wonderful book, American Mania, is that we have forgotten important truths about human nature. And I would completely agree with that. We have forgotten important truths that can be found in the Bible, and these are truths about human nature. And the biggest truth of all that we have forgotten is that the 7 deadly sins are truly deadly, and they are deadly because they are addictive. People who are addicted to selfishness will never accept anything that asks them to sacrifice or to cooperate or to compromise. Thus, they will reject the church, they will reject family, they will reject democracy, and they will reject morality, because those things demand sacrifice, cooperation, and compromise. Our society has been going through a process of secularization now for decades, for more than a generation, and for longer than that. And it's just that in the past few years, this process has accelerated dramatically. And as our de-Christianization has accelerated, so has our loss of self-control also accelerated. And there are all kinds of signs of it being written about in the newspapers. NBC News did an article about an epidemic of road rage incidents occurring on our streets. There have been so many articles, especially in 2015, that saw a huge explosion in mass shootings. And that trend, even though there are people that would like to deny it, that trend continues today in our big cities, with Chicago just shattering all kinds of records. Absolutely deplorable, absolutely pathetic what has become of our American culture in our big cities. And a very sickening statistic that I quote in my own book, The Immoral Landscape of the New Atheism, comes from the FBI, and that is that sex trafficking, sexual slavery, is the fastest growing crime in organized crime. And these are things, and I could give you more statistics, and I do. I give plenty more statistics in my own book. Obesity, sexually transmitted diseases, the list goes on and on. And it really paints a very sad picture for our future if we don't get smarter about human nature and the consequences to our minds and to our health if we reject these important truths about our human nature. No, human nature is not infinitely malleable. There are consequences to attempting to tamper with human nature. Now, this is something that is not, what we're seeing in America is not a surprise to Christians. It's a surprise to secular people. It's a surprise to people like Steven Pinker, who've been predicting some great golden age. They've been expecting, with the advent of a new secular America, they've been expecting a golden age to dawn, when just the opposite has happened. This is no surprise to Christians, because Christians have an accurate understanding of human nature. And Christians have been anticipating this for a long time, because it's in the Bible. It's in the letter of St. Jude. It's in one of St. Peter's letters. It's in the letter to the Romans. C.S. Lewis writes about this in a wonderful children's book, Prince Caspian, part of the Chronicles of Narnia series. He talks about a future England in which some of the people have gone wild inside, and the great fear that you wouldn't be able to tell the ones who were sane from the ones who had gone wild inside. Just a wonderful and insightful and prophetic children's story, really. And I found this, here's a quote from T.S. Eliot that I found from one of my friends on Facebook, and I'll go ahead and read this to you. T.S. Eliot here. The world is trying the experiment of attempting to form a civilized but non-Christian mentality. The experiment will fail, but we must be very patient in awaiting its collapse, meanwhile redeeming the time, so that the faith may be preserved alive through the dark ages before us, to renew and rebuild civilization and save the world from suicide. So here are the lessons that I take from If You Can Keep It. America's present political crisis is not fundamentally political, it is fundamentally spiritual. The mob violence and the vandalism that we've seen is evidence of this spiritual crisis. At the heart of this spiritual crisis is self-love, narcissism, which is addicting. A great spiritual truth that Hollywood needs to learn, that the left needs to learn, that atheists need to learn, and that is that no, not all love is equal, because self-love is narcissism. Self-love hates everything and everybody that asks for cooperation, compromise, and sacrifice. To save our democracy, we must reject the pagan, narcissistic values of the left, of Hollywood, and of the new atheists, because these values are addicting. And when we become addicted, we are incapable of compromise. And when compromise becomes impossible, democracy becomes impossible. And I leave you with this quote from Thomas Jefferson. Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis? A conviction in the minds of the people that those liberties are the gift of God, that they are violated, but with his wrath. I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, and that his justice cannot sleep forever. That concludes our presentation. Please pray for our country.